Welcome back to Snippets with Patterns by Jen, my friends. Today, our challenge is going to be an improv block. Improv is not something I am comfortable with in any way, shape, or form. However, in these small little bits, we can practice them a little bit, make something fun, and let go with our perfectionism. That would be my thing. I'm going to meet you over at the cutting mat. Go grab a couple of scraps if you want, just to play with, and then we'll walk through the challenge. I have pulled oranges and blues out of my scrap bucket. My living room colors currently are orange and blue, so I think I'll try and make a fun little piece for my living room with these. So it does not matter what size scraps you have, we're going to try and use a bunch of these for this challenge. So even this little, I think this is a 1.5 inch strip, I'm going to put to use. I have leftover triangles that I will put to use as well. So we're going to go ahead and set those aside as they are. And I think I'll do the same with these. I think, now again, this is not my strong point, improvisation. So I am definitely a traditional quilt piecer. So my tips I'm giving you are just what I have. I've made a handful of pieces like this. So my tips are what have worked for me and my brain that has to have this laid out a little bit more than just sew it all together. Okay. So I have some bigger blues here that I want to cut up, and I think the oranges, I'm going to set these pieces aside for now, knowing that they are cut and possibly ready to go. But I also, other than the triangles, they're also very straight or square. So for my first tip is to make sure you have all of your fabrics really well pressed. So the first thing is a good press. The other thing I like to do is have a nice straight edge to sew. So I have these pieces that are nicely cut because they were used for the monthly color challenge at some point, but I don't necessarily want all of my pieces to be completely perfectly rectangular or perfectly triangular for that matter. So I'm going to come in and just go ahead and make some cuts, but I like to have a straight cut to work with when I'm sewing. So I don't want it to be wavy because our seams are going to be straight underneath, just because possibly what we're sewing together isn't. Now, I'm sure you can also do wavy lines. That just, again, not really my forte. So I'm just going to cut some pieces that are random. I'm going to make this 6.5-inch block, which will finish at 6 inches. We're going to need a few pieces, especially because as we cut them down and then we sew them, we're losing a lot of fabric here in our seams. So I think I'm going to leave that. And I'm going to take some of these orange pieces too and give them some funky cuts. Again, just keeping the lines straight so I can sew these nicely. So what I'm going to do when I'm done cutting these up will be I'm going to sew, and then I'll trim a little and sew and trim a little. So I'm going to start with just sewing a few of these together, and then I'll come back and show you how I trim so that I can keep sewing, keep growing my pieces, and how that is going to work. I think I don't want to use that, but I kind of want to go maybe not so big. And so just have some fun with this cutting. It's kind of freeing to not have to worry about what your measurement is at or what the angles are going to be or anything like that. It's kind of fun just to go ahead and cut. So I'm going to grab some light blue. This time I'm just going to cut off a chunk here. All right, and we're going to go ahead and cut here. So again, I'm not worried about the size. I'm not worried about the angles. I just want straight edges and pieces that I can add. So I have these triangles as well that were already cut. And I will probably, so I already even have one of these. Probably I'll sew this together, trim it down a little bit, and add it in as well. Just play. So I have a lot of scraps I can use. I'm going to go ahead and start pulling these. So I'm going to sew that together. I'll leave this for now. And I'm just going to go ahead, just start sewing some of these pieces together and seeing what I come up with. I'll come back to show you my next step, because I'm going to sew a bunch of pieces together and press, and then I might trim some. I might add some more before trimming. Sometimes, and I'll show this to you too, but I'll sew like something like this together, but then I'll come in and just sew, you know, a seam here and trim all of that off, and then I've got a funky piece like that. So we're improvising here. We're going to do, you know, whatever the fabric calls us to do. So I'm going to go stitch a little bit and I will be back. I have my first few pieces sewn now, and I want to show you how I just don't pay attention to the edges. This one I kind of did because I thought it might be fun to add like a strip, maybe even this one. And now it's a different look to that block or that piece. And from here on out now, I will just take pieces and kind of match them up. I'll sew that. And this one I might trim to get a straight bottom, or I might just take it to the sewing machine and use and like sew here. So that's my quarter stitch, and flip it and trim off that extra. The pieces are just going to kind of come together as I pull them. I'm not going to really pay attention too much, again, to that shape or that angle. I just want to sew and have these fun, funky pieces start to grow. And you can see, I mean, I have these already sewn. So we are going to get a nice size piece by doing all of these together. And I think that just gives us a little bit more to play with as we get towards the end of this. So I'm going to keep sewing these pieces on and watching this grow. I brought you over with me to my sewing machine just so you can also see how I am going to piece these. I did not trim the bottom like I thought maybe I would. So I'm going to use this edge of the fabric as my guide for my seam allowance. And we will go ahead and just stitch this up. You can press your seams open if you want. We have a lot of seams happening here, or you can press to the side. It does not matter. If the seams are getting to be too much and you think it would be better to press them open, but you're a little nervous about the seams coming apart, especially as we are going ahead and sewing all of these, and we're playing with the fabric a lot, then I would put your stitch length down 1 or 2 and make those stitches a little bit tighter, and that should hold your seams together better for you. So with these, I am, as you can see, just chain piecing these units as I go, and I really have no rhyme or reason to what I'm choosing, which colors I'm putting together. This is all just sew as you go, basically. And I am working on letting go of that perfectionism and that need to have everything exactly the same. And again, like I said, it can be freeing, right? While you don't have to worry about what the stitches are doing. You don't have to worry about the cuts that you're making, or the fact that your angles are off. None of that matters with this, and that is kind of nice. I'm not gonna lie. And then pulling it all together will be an interesting piece for me as well. And it's just something new, and I kind of like it. So I'm gonna keep on sewing these smaller pieces into bigger pieces, and I will, when I get to the point where I'm going to trim some of these down to get them to now come together as larger units, I will bring you over to the cutting mat to see that. And it's interesting for me to see what will happen from this. And I'm kind of thinking I might, like, this piece is going to be pretty big, so I might actually cut this down into something else even as I'm adding this larger piece to it. But I can see it maybe being cut at a different angle and see what happens with that to make it fit into whatever it is that I'm going to make here. So I'm going to keep sewing and keep pressing. Okay, I'm going to go ahead, take what I have here and press it and see where I'm at with all of my units. These pieces have grown pretty quickly, so I think I am good. We'll see what I had, like if my blue and orange ratio is okay. But I think other than trimming some of this down, I think we're good for fabric pieces. So my next step is going to be trimming off some of the seam allowances here, because I just sewed. I don't want all this extra bulk. So I'm just going to line up my 1/4 inch mark on that seam and go ahead and trim off this extra. And there's a couple of these I have to do that too. And then I'm going to go ahead and start sewing these together instead of adding to the pieces that I have. Once I get this all trimmed up. Even this tiny little bit is going to add a lot of bulk, especially with all of the seams that we have going here. So I want to make sure all of that is trimmed off. Okay, so now that I have all of these units that are funky and weird, I'm going to just start matching up ones that maybe work well together size-wise. So like here, these would work pretty well. Again, I can trim off whatever I need to, but if I can maybe sew more all at one time, because you know I like to sit and sew for as long as possible, then I want to do that. So I'll put those together. I think I'll put those together. I have this funky piece I need to do something with. And I think, I don't know if I'll use that. That angle might be, even though I said we don't have to worry about angles, I have to think about that one and see what I do with that. Yeah, I think I'll do that one. Maybe I'll do that, something like that. Maybe I'll try and sew that one in and see how that works. So I'm going to take these over and I will be back. And I'm just going to continue playing and trimming with these pieces as I sew. I have a lot of funky pieces here, so I am going to take a minute now and maybe just trim off some of these angles so that I have a little bit more of a straight edge. Again, not going for perfectly square, but giving me some straight edges that I can now sew and use and maybe make it, because you can't sew into that. Well, you could, but you probably don't want to, or I don't want to. But if I can take some of these pointier pieces or these funky angles, take them down just a tish so that I can add now, you know, when I get to the point where I'm adding. And you can see I'm still going to have to trim to get to the size or the square that I want. And we will just trim those funky sides down a little bit. Because again, I just want a nice edge I can sew on, even though I'm still not looking for that perfect square yet. I just want pieces that I can add on to. And not sure what I'm doing with this piece yet. I don't know if that's going to make the cut, but we will just keep playing. I did grab this piece and just chose to sew here, and I didn't even use a seam guide or anything. I just sewed right down because I knew I wanted to catch this and fix that angle a little bit. So I'll trim that off, and now it can be added to my stack of units. Okay, so I still have this small one I need to add. And let's see, now I want this to be a 6.5 inch finish, so I do need to make sure, I might need to add a little bit more. I think I'm going to sew this one here. I have a few more pieces over at my sewing machine I might add. So, okay, I'm going to sew a little bit more. Just keep sewing. I think that's going to be our motto for this challenge. All right, I think I am about done. So these are going to be my two halves that I want to put together. So I'm going to want to give myself a straight edge to work with at least on one of these. And I think, just check where I'm at here again. I think I'll do this one. This one's a little bit, it's not a straight edge, but I think it's a little straighter than what this other piece. So let's just quick. I want to make sure I've got every little piece. Whether I know if it's going to be in there or not, I don't want to have a hole in my seam. And then I think I'm going to just take this over to the machine like this. And I'm going to, oh, I do have some extra here that so let me trim that extra off. Okay. All right, so I'm going to take this to my machine and I am going to make sure I have my angle right because I want to make sure again that I have a 6.5 inch piece. So I'm going to have to go up a little higher. So I'm going to go right along this edge. And I may need to add a little bit extra. Let's see here. So if I want to do a 1/4 inch there, a 1/4 inch all the way around. And because it's improv, I can move this around. So I'm going to go ahead, take this to the machine. I'm going to sew it at this angle, but I'm using this piece that I cut that straight edge. I'm using that as my guide for my 1/4 inch seam, and then I'll just trim off that. I'll trim off the extra, and then we will square this down to 6.5. I did end up needing to sew another little extra piece here because my square was going to fit on there. You gotta love those seam allowances and how much they take off, don't you? So I'm gonna trim this off. And I'm just going to bring my ruler up a little bit to get that. And then I have to trim off this extra fabric. Slide my ruler up. Because this doesn't have to be perfect, other than you do want to make sure you have that seam allowance. Oops. All right. And here we go. So now I'm going to square this up to 6.5. Now, if you have a mat that rotates, this would be a good time to use that. I do not have that. I am not going to look at the lines on my ruler at all. What I'm looking at are the pieces because as we know, as we just saw Jen mess up, those seam allowances take off a lot. And I want to make sure I get this teeny tiny little blue piece in there. So I'm going to move it over to make sure I can catch that and have that in there. And then that still leaves me with, I have a little bit over here. I'm going to pull that back over again because I don't want to, actually I think I can't get that in because here's my seam allowance, right? And if I'm just going to end up having to cut that piece off. That'll end up in the seam allowance, but I don't want to have it where this thick piece is here. Or do I care? Do I want to have that? Well, why don't I just twist my block a little bit? Or my square ruler. All right. So now I'm watching at this one and I'm watching up here and I can have a little piece. I need to move this way a little bit to make sure I have that piece. And I'm going to get just a little bit of that if I go now where I get none. So I think I'm just going to not worry about that fabric piece because I do want to keep this little fun corner I've got going there. Yeah. So again, with this type of piecing, there's a little freedom, but then there's a little bit of give and take as well. So I think I'm just going to call it good right here and stop messing with it. And then you also want to make sure that you are catching, I don't want to get too far up because then I have a hole in my square. So I'm going to make sure I'm down far enough for that and getting pieces that I want to get in here. All right, we're gonna have some small pieces. So we're gonna go ahead and cut that off. And all right, we're gonna remove all of that. And then after we have those two, we'll rotate it just like we would if we're, squaring up a half square triangle. We're gonna go ahead, line up our 6.5 inch square now on the edges and trim this off. And here is my square, my 6.5 inch square. I think this will make a cute little piece to hang. I'll quilt it up, hang it on a little mini hanger, and I think this will be really cute just in my little entryway, which is also right where my living room is. So it'll fit with that blue and orange theme. That's our improvisational piecing, and that is not a word I can say very easily, nor do, but we have finished it. How did that go? This was tough for me. I'm not gonna lie. I know I tried to be encouraging while we were making it. It's difficult to let go though sometimes. So are you going to make a small one, or are you gonna go big or go home? I can't wait to see what you make. Make sure you share in the Quilt and Learn with Patterns by Jen Facebook group, or send me an email at jen@patternsbyjen.com. I can't wait to see what you make, and I hope you make something you love.